I've worked in kind of public transport and crime for about 10 years now. About 2 years ago, I think it was, Transport for London contacted me and they came and asked me to help them look at a tool they were developing. So it was to look at pickpocketing on the underground. Once you're on the system, you're taken somewhere and you have no control over who gets on. You're kind of in the system, and until you get to a door where you can get off and you have to pass someone, it's really difficult. So it has this kind of taking you into the unknown. Whereas if you were walking down the street and you saw something you didn't like, you could probably turn around and walk down another street. Whereas on this fixed system of networks, you kind of get taken to somewhere that you kind of don't have control over where you go.
Central Line train to West Ruislip.
There's lots of different passengers and they have different levels of awareness. So we have school children perhaps not going to school, you have commuters, regular travellers, you have tourists, you have people making one-off journeys, people that perhaps making journeys for kind of special events. So you have this whole range of people on something that moves. Then you travel through a different range of environments, so this risk profile constantly changes. And the other thing that's kind of unique about the transport environment is there's definite patterns that are different in terms of weekday and weekend. So there are some very different patterns in terms of the pickpocketing risk during the week and during the weekend. Stations which had more lifts and waiting rooms, and by lifts I mean where actually the lifts are the main access down to the platform, where there was high levels of accessibility, nearby paths, nearby roads, where they were in kind of a high-risk area nearby. Those that were classified more as tourist stations, and stations that are something that we call attractors of crime, which have got both a high count of theft and also a high rate. So whether the count is just the number of thefts there are and the rate is the number of thefts per passenger. And when you have both, that tends to be another factor. People can be easily distracted when they're travelling. They can get complacent, they might be tired, they might be travelling with children. There's also a lot of accessibility issues, so sometimes access is quite easy and then escape is also quite easy to get on and out of the system. With pickpocketing, you don't really know where and when it is, so what we did is we take a single offence where we know where the victim got on and where they got off. You look at the start station and the end station, and then between each station we call it a segment. So you have a series of segments and a series of stations that they pass through, and we don't know the risk at all at each one, so we give each station and each segment an equal risk, and then you run that for the 5,063 offences that there were on the London Underground in 2011, 2012. Once you've done this 5,063 times, you've got each station, each segment has got a risk that you accumulate. The other thing we have to do is adjust it for the number of passengers, because some stations and segments get used a lot more than others, so we then weight it by the number of passengers to give us a kind of rate, and that produces what we call the interstitial crime analysis. And what we actually found was the model was quite accurate in terms of where it predicted high risk stations, and more importantly when we looked at it by time of day. Pickpocketing's much more problematic at peak travel times, and when you looked at the peak travel times, at station pickpocketing and the nearby station pickpocketing all coincided in time and place, so we were kind of confident that with the results of the model. One of the things about crime data in general is that there is a large extent of underreporting, and it varies by crime type model. And we think that mobile phones theft might be quite a large proportion for theft on the underground. Although we know that there's going to be missing crime data, we can only work with what we know. I mean, one of the things about theft is that although crime has been coming down in England and Wales for the past sort of 10 or 15 years, and it's been reducing at a steady rate, in the last couple of years theft is the only one that's sort of plateaued or started to peak a little bit. One of the things we found was there's a definite link between what happens at a station and what happens near to a station in terms of pickpocketing risk, and it's quite concentrated at peak travel times. So obviously if you use this model, we can kind of determine stations where we should kind of target our resources. Around the boundaries of a transit station there's kind of a blur in terms of who manages it, who's got responsibility. You've got kind of a station manager that's responsible for the station. You're going to have British Transport Police who are responsible for the rail system, and then around the station, the local police force in London, the Metropolitan Police Force, will be kind of responsible for that. And you have this kind of changeover boundary where does one line stop and when does one line start. So one of the things I'd like to see is some more joined up working in terms of sharing information about what operations they're running, what intelligence they have on offenders, any information on vulnerable people perhaps that use the system. There's a bit of a culture shift I think needed, because I think in the past there's been historically a bit of it's different offenders that operate. So the BTP think they've got their own offenders and the Met think they've got their own pickpockets, and actually my evidence or our evidence suggests that this might not be the case. And the other thing that I'd like to see is whether the kind of plainclothes versus uniformed officers, what difference that has in terms of pickpocketing.